The halls of Elite Oak Academy smelled of expensive floor wax and old money. For most, it was a temple of progress, but for Samuel, it was a labyrinth of ghosts. At 70 years old, his back was bowed from decades of pushing mops across marble floors. He was a shadow in a blue jumpsuit, a man whose presence was only acknowledged when a trash can overflowed. To the students, he was part of the architecture. To Mrs. Sterling, the academy's principal, he was a necessary eyesore. Mrs. Sterling moved through the corridors like a cold front, her heels clicking with rhythmic precision. She valued two things: the prestige of the academy and the donations that kept it running. She viewed education as a luxury product for those who could afford the premium. One Tuesday, the friction between their worlds ignited. Samuel had been mopping near the principal's office when a rush of students forced him to step back. In his haste, he left his bucket too close to her mahogany door. The door swung open, and Mrs. Sterling stepped out, nearly tripping. The humiliation was surgical. She pointed at the bucket and then at Samuel, her voice loud enough to draw a crowd of snickering teenagers. She asked if his brain could grasp the concept of an unobstructed walkway, or if floor cleaner had dissolved his mind. Samuel remained silent, his eyes fixed on his worn shoes. He offered no defense, only a quiet apology that she dismissed with a wave of her manicured hand. The atmosphere changed when a visiting professor from a top-tier university arrived. In the center of the main hall stood a massive glass board. On the professor scribbled a legendary mathematical theorem across its surface. It was a problem that had remained unsolved for 20 years. The stakes were high. The university offered a massive endowment to the academy and a full scholarship to any student who could solve it. For 3 days, the academy was paralyzed. The star students, whose parents bought them the best tutors, stared at the numbers until their eyes blurred. The senior faculty members, people with doctorates and egos to match, huddled in groups, only to reach dead ends. Mrs. Sterling's frustration grew into embarrassment. She had promised the board a showcase of brilliance, but instead, the glass board remained a taunting reminder of their collective failure. On the third night, Mrs. Sterling found Samuel standing before the board. He wasn't cleaning it. He was simply looking, his head tilted as if listening to music only he could hear. A cruel smile touched her lips. She walked up to him, her voice dripping with sarcasm. She told him that staring at it wouldn't make the numbers turn into a grocery list. "If a floor scrubber like you can solve this," she mocked, "I'll personally clean the hallways for a month." Her laughter echoed through the empty hall as she walked away. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. When the moon reached its peak, the academy fell into a heavy silence. Samuel set down his mop. The weight in his shoulders seemed to vanish as he picked up a marker. His hand moved with a fluid, haunting grace, filling the glass with complex calculations. He wasn't just solving a math problem. He was speaking a language he hadn't used in decades. The numbers danced under his fingers, bridging gaps that the world's greatest minds had failed to see. He worked with a frantic yet focused energy until the first light of dawn touched the glass, leaving the first half of the theorem perfectly solved with logic so profound it was almost art. He replaced the marker, picked up his mop, and disappeared into the boiler room. When the school arrived early that morning, the absolute frenzy began. The impossible had finally happened, and the mystery of the invisible academic genius was officially and truly born this morning. The morning at Elite Oak Academy was electric, a storm of whispers and flash photography that Mrs. Sterling navigated with practiced poise. She didn't seek the truth, but she sought a convenient face to pin the brilliance upon, someone who fit the academy's polished image. Her eyes landed on Julian, the billionaire's son. She pulled him into her office, offering praise and subtle pressure, practically begging him to claim the work. If Julian were the genius, prestige would skyrocket. But the boy could only stutter, unable to decipher the complex symbols on the glass. The principal's desperation grew as the university board demanded a name, yet the real author remained as elusive as a silent ghost. Unknown to the administration, a witness had been lurking in the shadows. Leo, a thin scholarship student whose clothes were always a size too large, had seen everything. At 3 a.m, Leo watched as Samuel transformed. The old man's back straightened, his movements becoming fluid. The way Samuel's hand glided across the glass wasn't just math, it was a symphony of logic. When Samuel finally stepped back, Leo didn't run. He descended the stairs, his voice trembling as he asked why a man who could solve the impossible spent his days scrubbing dirty toilets. Samuel didn't startle at the boy's presence. He looked at Leo with eyes filled with a sharp clarity. Over the next hour, a bond formed in the quiet hall. Samuel didn't just explain the theorem. He mentored the boy, helping him understand physics problems that had been crushing his confidence. Between the equations, a painful truth emerged. Samuel had once been a titan of mathematics, a man whose name was whispered in the same breath as Nobel laureates. But decades ago, a brilliant student he loved like a son had made a catastrophic error. To save the young man from prison, Samuel had claimed the mistake as his own, disappearing into a self-imposed exile as a humble janitor. By noon, the visiting professor returned, his jaw dropping as he traced the new lines of logic. He ignored Mrs. Sterling's attempts to introduce Julian, pushing past the wealthy parents and clicking cameras. He stated firmly that only 3 people in the world possessed the cognitive architecture to bridge these specific gaps. 1 was dead, 1 was incapacitated, and the 3rd had vanished decades ago. The tension thickened. Mrs. Sterling, feeling control slip, retreated to her office to scour security footage. Cameras were for students, leaving the board in a blind spot, but she remained entirely relentless. Finally, she just found the evidence. In a high-definition shot of the trophy case, she saw a distorted reflection. It wasn't a designer jacket or a faculty coat. It was the unmistakable janitorial jumpsuit. Rage, cold and sharp, replaced her confusion. To her, this wasn't a discovery of talent. It was a personal insult to the Academy's status. She didn't see a miracle. She saw a servant who had dared to touch something sacred. A man she assumed must have stolen an answer key to mock her. She found Samuel in the boiler room, the humid, roaring heart of the building. She didn't come with questions. She came with security and malice. She cornered him against a wall of vibrating pipes, accusing him of vandalism and theft. She hissed that a man who couldn't afford a tie had no right to play games with her institution. She threatened to call the police and ensure he spent his remaining years in a cell, refusing to believe that the mind she had mocked could be superior to her own. Samuel stood his ground, his face a mask of calm dignity, even as the sirens began to wail. The police arrived just as the university professor burst into the room, followed by a confused crowd. Mrs. Sterling pointed a finger at Samuel, demanding his arrest. But the professor stopped dead. His eyes widened in disbelief and profound reverence as he finally recognized that face. The professor's voice didn't just break the silence. It shattered the fragile foundation of Mrs. Sterling's reality. He didn't look at the police or the surrounding onlookers. Instead, he moved toward the man in the faded blue jumpsuit with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. "Dr. Vance?" he whispered, his eyes searching Samuel's weathered face. Then the room fell into a vacuum of shock as the most prestigious mathematician in the country ignored the social elite to stand before a humble janitor. The professor turned to the crowd, declaring that they were standing in the presence of a lost legend of the academic world. He explained that Samuel had once been a titan of mathematics who chose professional exile decades ago to protect a student's future, trading his fame for integrity. Mrs. Sterling's face went a shade of gray, her lips trembling as she stammered about the answer key and the impossibility of a laborer understanding such theory. To silence the mockery, the professor stepped to the glass board and handed Samuel a marker. The entire school watched, the donors, the faculty, and the students who had been told that wealth equaled worth. Samuel approached the glass not as a servant, but as a master. The stoop in his shoulders vanished, replaced by the commanding presence of a genius. He began to write. The sound of the marker was rhythmic, like a heartbeat in the hall. Samuel didn't just solve the remainder of the theorem. He elevated it, weaving together multiple branches of mathematics once deemed incompatible. The calculations flowed with a haunting speed, a symphony of numbers speaking of a lifetime of hidden contemplation and solitude. When he finally drew the closing symbol, the solution to a problem that had stumped the world for 20 years was complete. The professor didn't need to check the math. The elegance of the proof was its own verification. He wept, realizing his own mentor had been cleaning the floors beneath his feet for years. Then the aftermath was swift. The university board and the donors turned their gaze toward Mrs. Sterling with pure disgust. They had witnessed her attempt to humiliate and arrest a man whose intellect outweighed the school's entire endowment. The lead board member informed her that her elitist prejudice rendered her unfit to lead. Her obsession with status had blinded her to the excellence she claimed to cultivate. She had seen a jumpsuit and decided it was worthless, an error the board would not overlook. In the wake of the revelation, Samuel was offered everything he had lost: a university chair, a massive salary, and his old fame. But Samuel looked at Leo, the scholarship student in the shadows, and he saw the future. He politely declined the university's offer. He chose instead to stay at Elite Oak Academy as a mentor. He demanded that the school's resources be redirected toward those who lacked the means but possessed the mind, ensuring students like Leo would never again be dismissed by people like Mrs. Sterling. The final justice was a quiet one. Mrs. Sterling was stripped of her title and fired for her prejudicial leadership. Weeks later, the new principal watched from the window as a humbled, unemployed Mrs. Sterling walked past the school gates for the last time. In a sunlit classroom nearby, Samuel sat with his students, the glass board behind him filled with the dreams of the generation. He wasn't just teaching them equations. He was teaching them that brilliance is found in the character, not the uniform. The legend was no longer lost. He had finally found his home, proving that the most profound truths are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for a kind enough heart to see them.